Well, thanks very much to Stephen, and let me say welcome home. We're pleased to have you back here, back in the Parliament building. To Paul McClintock, to Ian Watt, who was head of the public service through an extraordinarily distinguished career. Bill Ferris, who is the chair of Innovation and Science Australia, as well as having had a profound impact on the venture capital and the startup sector within the country. And all of you here today, I was looking in my mind, Stephen, for the right collective noun for a group of people within the CEDA sphere, and I think it must be a galaxy of CEDA members and guests. I think you're right. I think this is a really important portfolio and something I'm absolutely passionate about in terms of the future life and prosperity of the nation and job opportunities for individuals. So I really want to lay out a framework and then in particular engage in a dialogue around the elements of industry and innovation and science, and to give you a unifying direction on where they're heading. I'll look at that through the three areas of macroeconomic reform, microeconomic reform within the industry space, and then the second and third waves of the innovation and science agenda. So macroeconomic, microeconomic, and then the innovation and science agenda going forwards. But let me begin in some definitional spaces, because people wonder, well, they hear the term innovation, and I've said it's not just about black skivvies in Paddington, although I have nothing against black skivvies in Paddington. I own one myself and I'm occasionally in Paddington. But it's about people from all walks of life. And the starting point here is that when we talk about innovation, it's new businesses, because you've seen almost 1.5 million jobs created in new businesses or businesses that are scaling up from being 0 to 25 people up to well north of 100 over a 5-year period. So an incredibly important driver of the economy. But it's also about old and existing businesses, and I very consciously chose to visit Dulux, a 100-year-old paint firm, as my first major business visit after coming into the portfolio, only just a few days afterwards. This was an example of an Australian firm making what seems in many ways like a commoditised product, but they have an R&D centre in Clayton, where you literally have the people in the white coats, and they were testing new antibacterial paints for hospitals. They were looking at new longer-lasting paints to survive my 7-year-old. They were interested in recruiting him to do the Bolognese test, by the way. And they were looking at new pigments, new hues, and then new ways of manufacturing. And from that R&D, within an existing 100-year-old Australian firm, they were able to go on and produce new paints, but then they looked at new production methods, so new manufacturing and new business models, and incorporated across a wider range of products. There's a $165 million manufacturing plant being built in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. That plant therefore creates a first wave of jobs in terms of the people who are engaged in the construction. Then you have the ongoing manufacturing jobs, and then you have all of the sales jobs. From a shareholder or business perspective, the firm has tripled its market capitalisation over the last 6 years. So that's an example of what I mean by innovation, not just in new businesses, although they are immensely important and inextricably linked to the future of the economy, but in existing businesses. By contrast, and we need to be honest, I met all three of the CEOs of the Australian car manufacturing industry as it leaves the country. I met with them last Thursday, and we talked about the why. And basically they said, in a fragmented market, we weren't world-class competitive. And so that is the absolute heart of what we have to look at. As you know, if you are investing capital either in a small business or if you're part of a global firm, you'll only have capital allocated if they believe our Australian operations will be world-class competitive. And in the end, nothing can hide from that ineluctable law of economics. You just have to be competitive. So our job as a government, and my job as the custodian responsible for this space, is to help create the conditions by which Australian firms will have the best shot at being world-class competitive. Bill Ferris's job is to help, in particular, to assist with that in the innovation and science space. But right across that value chain, right across the chain of maturity, what is the task here? It's to help our firms have the environment in which they can be world-class competitive. Now, how does that translate in reality? In the innovation space, I think of it as industry is the jobs of today, innovation is the jobs of tomorrow, and science is the jobs of the future. There's a natural continuum there. But the innovation part matters because it's a word that can be lost, but when you think of it in a very simple term, it's about productivity, new ways of doing things and better ways of doing things. And to break it down to its simplest form, 45% of Australian firms at the moment are engaged in innovative behaviour. 70% of our jobs are within those firms that are engaged in innovation, and 60% of our national productivity comes from innovation. So the biggest driver of better living standards in Australia is productivity, and the biggest driver of productivity is innovation. So that's why it matters. And that's a global story, and it's a competitive story. So you say then, well, what is it that we can do, and what should we be doing to try to push this forward? So there are really the three things of the macro, the micro, and then the innovation and science agenda. In terms of the macroeconomic, you can boil it down to three big things. Firstly, there's the combination of budget and tax settings. In all of your businesses, you know that if you run at a loss for a prolonged period, it will end in tears. We're back to Mr. Micawber and Charles Dickens for the most basic lessons of business survival and economics and happiness on that front. As a government, the same rules apply. The lead times to unhappiness and pain can be a little bit longer, but the lesson from the Medicis through the Ottomans, through the Spanish Empire, to the contemporary examples within the 20th and the 21st century is that you can't avoid that law of economics. So when our job is about getting the budget back to surplus, and we'll get there, I have absolutely no doubt about it, we take it deadly seriously. What does the Cabinet talk about every week without giving dark secrets away that will lead to terrible things happening? It talks about what does each portfolio have to do two things: to rein in expenditure, and there are hard decisions that are required with that, and then to assist with growth. So there are two ways out of this, and they're complementary, they're not alternatives. One is to limit, moderate expenditure. The second is to generate revenue, not by a higher taxing regime, but by having the economy grow. That is the simple approach, and we actually focus within the Cabinet on a weekly basis on that as virtually the starting question every week of what is each portfolio or specific portfolios doing to push that forward. Related to that is business tax. In a competitive world where the UK is at 20% and moving to 15% for its business tax environment, we have to be more competitive. We are setting out a pathway for small business first, but larger business, all businesses, to head towards the 25% tax rate. And I think, Stephen, this is somewhere where CEDA can play a hugely important role. The fact that in a highly competitive world for capital, businesses and investors have the option where they place their capital. Do they do an expansion in Australia? Do they start up something overseas? Because you have choices, and financiers have choices, and investors have choices. And so arguing that Australia needs to have a competitive business tax environment is something where there's a natural partnership. It's not about lining the pockets of the big bankers or other people like that. It's frankly when you're a firm such as BlueScope, which has been through a turnaround from 300 million loss to 300 million profit and has done many hard things, but they're also competing for scarce capital, and they wondered, do we set up a new business line here in Australia, or you're a firm such as CSL, which made a real world decision not to set up a plant 3 to 4 years ago within Australia, but to set up in Europe because of the tax regime in Switzerland. What will drive your decision? Productivity is one critical element, business environment is a second, and tax is a third. And so that common engagement on pushing for a national 25% business tax rate is something that I think is a common purpose that we can share, and hopefully engage as many of you as possible in speaking behind the scenes, but also speaking as a unified voice publicly on that importance. Then the next thing is in terms of industrial relations, and everybody will have differing views on this, but there are two significant bills that we think will improve the industrial relations environment within Australia. One is the Registered Organisations Bill. The second is in relation to the Australian Building and Construction Commission. That's about a massive increase in productivity in the built construction environment, the commercial construction environment. Some estimates have said that there's potentially a third increase in productivity and cost effectiveness as a result in the most heavily unionised work sites. And both of these are simply about a level playing field. And so they are extremely important. And then the third of the big areas after budget and tax, secondly, industrial relations, and the third is the question of free trade. Obviously, where we've been with China, Japan, Korea, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whilst we've struck the agreement, we have to make sure that it gets the support, particularly in the United States. And there is a hard road to hoe on that front, and we're hopeful that it'll be resolved this calendar year before we have to manage a change of administration in no matter what direction in the United States. So we're working. We can't guarantee what the US Congress will do. But the next wave of trade agreements include Europe and the Middle East, the UK, and also India and Indonesia. And so we're working on that next set of 5 potential free trade agreements. And at a moment when the world is pausing on free trade, and I'll come to that challenge in a second, at a moment when the world is pausing, we are trying to push ahead because we think there's actually a comparative advantage for Australia on that front. And then you say, well, why is the world pausing? And there's a very interesting study that McKinsey did, and this goes to part of the common challenge we have. Between 1993 and 2005, 98% of the developed world saw an increase in real wages. So these were people in factories, these were people on shop floors, in retail, so their actual living standards advanced. From 2005 to 2013-14, the last available figures, 2/3 of the Western world either had stagnating or declining real wages. Now, some of that was offset by changes in welfare, but that, of course, has an impact on the budgetary sustainability of those societies. So if you want to look in one figure at the cause of much of the dissatisfaction in the developed world, whether it's movements of the left or of the right, but of a populist nature, whether it's in the United States or the UK, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere, less so in Australia because we have to a certain extent defied that trend. It's this failure of real wages to grow, and therefore the productivity agenda becomes absolutely essential. So then you say, well, at the microeconomic level, what are the levers that we've got that are assisting to drive that forward? And there are really 3 big ones here within my portfolio. We have the growth centres, which is a $250 million program. We have the entrepreneurs program, a $400 million commercialisation program, and then we have the CRCs, the Cooperative Research Centres, which is about $650 million. It's not the money, it's the fact that we are providing opportunity. We're not going to go throw good money after bad. We've just seen, sadly, Ford close its doors for production but not for design. They'll have a design team of 1,100, an operating team of nearly 1,600, and all up 2,000 in their employment orbit. So it's nowhere near what some have said. There's quite a significant Ford presence going forward. But the manufacturing, we know, is ending on all three fronts. It's ending despite $7 billion of government money which went after the car sector since 2000. $7 billion, and it still didn't save it. So at the end of the day, the lesson is you've got to be competitive. So that brings me to the growth centres. Now, the growth centres operate in 6 areas, and they're really about one word, and that is investment. Driving investment in Australia across 6 different areas. We've got the Mining Equipment and Technology Growth Centre. We have the Advanced Oil and Energy Growth Centre. We also have the Advanced Food Manufacturing and Agriculture Growth Centre. So in that space, we have an enormous opportunity where we can value add to our food. And right now, the whole notion of digital information applied to agricultural productivity and then to transformation of agricultural product into advanced food is going forwards at a dramatic space. I think on the digital side, you would say Israel is probably number 1 in the world, but then Australia and the US are a very competitive equal number 2. And the combination of satellite data, advanced machinery on the ground, and highly sophisticated farmers. Our farmers are the new Renaissance people. They have to manage economics, they have to manage meteorology, they have to manage plant biology, and then they're managing advanced equipment and advanced digital information. So we are right at the forefront there. The other 3 include the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, the Medical Equipment and Pharmaceutical Growth Centre, and now the new Cybersecurity. So those are areas where in each of those cases, what we're doing is we're bringing some of the best people in the sector, and their job, which we've boiled down to a single word, is investment. To act as investment brokers overseas, to try to provide opportunities for Australian firms, to help provide contractual opportunities. For example, the Advanced Food Manufacturing Growth Centre has brought international buyers together with Australian producers. 50% of the meetings they have brokered have produced contracts for Australian firms within the Asia Pacific. Now that is a real example of government getting it right. And I think that that's a constructive thing where we're not throwing money at sectors. We are providing connections and linkages which would otherwise not have existed. Similarly, building along on domestic commercialisation, the Entrepreneurs Program is about making sure we've got people in Oz industry who are contracted in because they've been successful men or women in business, and they are mentoring and providing commercialisation pathways, and then we'll back that up with grants of up to $1 million for assisting in new commercialisation of products which are being developed, whether it's primary, secondary or tertiary industry, and our expectation is that that's likely to lead to a very significant growth benefit and an investment benefit. The third of the areas is the cooperative research centres. Now within those cooperative research centres, we have 31 at the moment. We'll be looking at a roll-on, roll-off after every 6 to 7 years of six or so cooperative research centres each year. From the 1st of July 2018, so the next round which we'll launch, we'll look at half of them being national interest priorities and half of them being open topic, but all of them being competitive. The real point here is these are enormous opportunities to drive forward investment as we build in each of the cooperative research centres. They are industry and university and research working together, and will be engaging the universities a lot more in precincts and hubs going forward in terms of a driver of economic growth, and I'll just come to that. So if you think of the industry side, you have the growth centres, which are delivering contracts and investment. You then have the Entrepreneurs Program, which is providing a pathway for early stage commercialisation, and then you have the cooperative research centres, which are assisting in that longer term scientific underpinning for many of the emerging sectors and industries. So then you say, well, what is the National Innovation and Science Agenda? Now, overarching that is Innovation and Science Australia. And there are three waves. The first wave, I think we all know, that was launched in December last year. That was built around big science infrastructure, the synchrotron, the square kilometre array, the quantum computing centre at UNSW with significant funds. Then in particular talent and the process of getting younger people into science and into technology and engineering and maths. Huge gap on the gender equality side here. We get 1 out of 4 science graduates being women, and just over 1 out of 10 engineering graduates as a woman in the second decade of the 21st century. So that's just a historic legacy which is completely unacceptable. So the partnership that we struck with the chancellors of the universities last week was to have them go into the universities, to have their professors, to have their grads going from the universities into the schools. And then the next day we did the same with business. And Stephen, I think one thing here that would be critical is if CEDA were to agree to partner with the universities in getting young professionals in science and engineering and commerce, where they've come through the science or maths or engineering streams, into the schools, because nothing will inspire somebody if they can see the fun and the interest of science or maths or engineering and see the career opportunities. And it's people that make that available to young women who are in years 7, 8, 9 or 10. That's the partnership I think that we want to strike going forwards. The next part of what we're doing in terms of the innovation and science agenda, the second wave, which we're looking at bringing out in the last part of the second quarter, so about first quarter of next year, about March of next year, is built around investment and built around critical science infrastructure. So right now, the Finkel-Ferris Fraser report on the R&D tax incentive has been placed on the table for public consultation. That's running until the end of the month. Then we've got another 2 months of informal consultations. But that's the platform for an investment approach going forward. And we've already got in place an angel investors program, an early stage venture capital program. The success of the Biomedical Translation Fund, which is 250 million of government funds to attract at least 250 million of private funds, is overwhelming. And that's providing the model for a potential national innovation fund, which could be focusing on science translation, on agricultural data translation, and also advanced manufacturing, amongst other things. And so investment becomes the heart of what we do there, and we're looking for and open for your suggestions as to the impediments that we can remove, which will assist with investment growth, or the actions that we can take that will assist with investment growth. The other part is that Alan Finkel, the Chief Scientist, is at this moment producing a National Critical Science Infrastructure Roadmap. So the big science, the next square kilometre array and synchrotron, each of which have built and are building enormous new business investment realities around their particular scientific infrastructure. And so we're looking at a critical science infrastructure funding package going long term to support the next equivalent of the synchrotron. And you may have suggestions, then you can come to myself, to Bill Ferris, to Alan Finkel. Then the third wave of what we're looking at, probably to come out in May or June 2018, is constructed around two ideas: business simplification and collaboration in university precincts. Now, the business simplification, we are shortly about to launch a national business simplification initiative. Federal, state, local, together. A single business entry point for as many of those items as possible. And what's different is we're doing it ground up. So, for example, instead of just saying we'll have simplification, we will take the case study of new cafe formation in Sydney and try to change the time frame from 7 months to 2 months, because that dead period where there's no income but your capital's on the table is one of the biggest deterrents to people creating and forming new businesses. So we're going to start with 12 case studies where we are going to crack the nut on each of them to reduce the timeframes. It might also be a simple approach, for example, that Kate Carnell raised with me this morning, of childcare. So we're aligning federal and state times for approval of new childcare businesses. Things that will make a difference. I think of it in terms of months, bringing it from 7 down to 2 months. In the environment space, we halved the approval times. Now we can do the same in general licensing and business formation. The other thing that we're doing here is university precincts. So we know that in Australia, on average, a business that's located in a university hub or precinct will have job formation at about 2.25 times the national average. Across the OECD, a business that is an advanced manufacturing business within a university hub or precinct will grow its jobs at about 15% per annum, and a knowledge business within a university hub or precinct will grow at about 24.5%. So that's hard data from 80 precincts right across the OECD. We haven't actually had a national policy on hubs and precincts within the universities of seeing that as a driver of national growth. And that's one of the things that we will be taking forward and producing as part of the working on in the meantime, but reaching a final point on with the universities and the sector as part of the third wave, which we'll have in 2018. So I see the innovation agenda as a continuous process. So that's a quick summary. You're the people that create the jobs. Our job is to give you the best opportunity to do that. And Stephen, I'd be delighted to take any questions. Thank you.